This is Chapter 2 of Inner Chaos by Greb and Hades. Chapter 2, New Encounters. Sweet Apple Acres, CMC Clubhouse. Applejack ran as fast as she could once the clubhouse was in sight and her worst fears were confirmed. There was a blazing fire roaring out of control, and her sister along with her friends were most likely trapped inside. The intense heat made itself known to her the closer she got. She began to worry about how she was going to get them out. She skidded to a halt and began looking around, hoping that perhaps Caramel had left the ladder out close by, but had no such luck. It was then that she heard a small coughing a little ways from her, to the right, just past some bushes, a small distance away. She quickly trotted over, a small glimmer of hope igniting in her heart, that perhaps they were already out and safe, away from the flames. What she saw, though, struck fear into her heart. A large creature was on its knees, looming over her sister. It was breathing heavily and wore a strange cloth around it, keeping most of its form hidden. Despite this, she saw a glowing red light fading from a pair of gems on its arms. Her gaze followed the arms down to what she could tell were digits of some sort, which struck similarity in her mind to Spike's claws. This creature was large. It may have started the fire, and it looked like it was going to hurt her sister. She wasn't about to let anything happen to little Apple Bloom or the other CMCs, so she sprang into action. Leaping out of the bushes, she bellowed as she ran at them at breakneck speed. "What in tarnation?" Before the creature could react, she quickly turned her finely tuned muscles, preparing for an all-too-familiar action. She bucked her legs as hard as she could, and was rewarded with a solid crack of hoof meeting flesh and bone. The blow sent the creature back several feet onto its back, causing it to groan softly as it brought one of its hands to its head. Applejack narrowed her vibrant green eyes as she stepped up between the girls and the creature, ready to strike again. She pawed at the ground and grit her teeth as she heard a deep voice grunt and mumble from the creature. "Great." Applejack lowered her head again, her Stetson still tilted back. "You keep your good-for-nothing mitts off my sister. I'm not going to let anything, any pony, hurt her." Apple Bloom coughed again as she moved to her hooves and stood up. But sis..." "Quiet, Apple Bloom. You don't know what this creature is." Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo both stepped up a bit, joining their friend, while Apple Bloom frowned and sat down, watching her sister and the creature. But Applejack was about to turn her head to her sister to settle the issue when there was a sudden flash of light, pulling all their attention to it, and away from the man sitting up and moving to a kneeling position in front of them. Scene change. Ponyville, the town library. Twilight smiled as she levitated several books over onto a nearby table, while Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash looked on with wide eyes. "Here you go, girls. Your next set of books." Twilight's horn glowed as the four of them moved from the stack down onto the table in front of Fluttershy, followed by another set landing in front of Rainbow Dash. "The latest books on veterinary science for Fluttershy, and the newest books starring Daring Do for Dash." Fluttershy gulped as she peeked around the stack, looking at Twilight. "Oh my, I didn't expect this many new additions, but I look forward to learning all sorts of new ways to help my animal friends." She smiled sweetly as she opened the top of the stack. Rainbow Dash chuckled as she grabbed the first book she could reach. "Fluttershy, I think you read too many books like that. You should try Daring Do. These stories rock." She grinned as she began to read. "Nothing's better than a Daring Do story." "Well, they are a little too exciting for me." Twilight laughed as she opened her own book, but frowned when there was a knocking at the door. "Every time," she sighed as she closed her book and trotted over to the door. She opened it to an unexpected sight. There, breathing deeply, a big, sweaty Big Macintosh stood, with a look of concern on his face. "Big Mac?" "Yup." "Well, what are you doing here?" She paused, bringing her hoof to her chin. He was about to open his mouth to answer her, but was interrupted by Rainbow Dash trotting over. Well, duh, Twilight. He's here to get the newest Farmer's Almanac. Big Mac paused and shook his head. Nope. Fluttershy floated over. Well, maybe he needs a book on some new farming techniques. He again shook his head, glancing over his shoulder, a bit of nervousness beginning to show in his eyes. Nope. Twilight frowned. Well, what could it be? She looked down and grinned as a realization hit her. Oh, I know. You're here to pick up new books on building sheds and barn. Big Mac placed a large hoof over her mouth and shook his head. Nope. He quickly pulled his hoof back and pointed over his shoulder, revealing a large storm brewing over at Sweet Apple Acres in the distance. Rainbow frowned as she shot out the front door and rose into the air several feet. What the? There isn't supposed to be a storm like that for at least 2 weeks. Twilight frowned as she, Big Mac, and Fluttershy all trotted outside. Rainbow, the last time there was weather like this, you didn't expect we had a visit from... Fluttershy shivered, her eyes wide with realization. Discord. Rainbow Dash narrowed her eyes and let her gaze travel over to the treetops of Sweet Apple Acres, where she saw something that put a great deal of fear into her heart. The faint trail of black smoke rising through the air. Twilight, there's trouble! Hearing the concern in Dash's voice, Twilight narrowed her eyes. I'm guessing we need to get over there quickly then. Alright, every pony, stay close to me and hang on. Rainbow landed next to her as Big Mac as well as Fluttershy huddled in a little closer. Twilight closed her eyes in concentration as her horn began to glow strongly with its purple hue. Suddenly all of them were enveloped in the familiar glow, which then began to grow brighter and brighter until a flash filled the air. They were gone. Scene change. Sweet Apple Acres. Dusk. Applejack smiled, seeing her brother and her friends. They seemed a little disorientated from their teleport, but after a moment they saw the Cutie Mark Crusaders as well as Applejack with a burning clubhouse in the background. Rainbow Dash didn't hesitate to shoot into the air, grabbing a few stray clouds, and she quickly pushed them over the clubhouse, holding her breath from the smoke. With a few kicks, she was able to unleash a torrent of rainwater, extinguishing the flames. After a few moments, all that remained was a few smoldering boards. She then shot into the sky and began to clear the storm clouds from view. Fluttershy, seeing the condition of the young fillies, rushed right over and began to check them over. Oh, my dearies, are you all right? You're not burned, are you? She was stopped by Sweetie Belle placing a hoof over her mouth. We're fine. We really are. In fact, Apple Bloom is better than before. Oh, what do you mean? Scootaloo rose to her hind legs. This thing, it saved us. Twilight paused, as did the others, all turning to face the young orange filly. What saved you? Scootaloo shrugged her shoulders. I don't know. It was what it was, but it was tall, strong, and fast. It leaped into the clubhouse and pulled us out of there before it got too intense. It was amazing. Applejack frowned. Wait a sec. You mean to tell me that thing? She pointed her hoof over her shoulder back, where she had just bucked him. Saved you from the fire? Fluttershy shifted nervously on her hooves. Applejack? What, Fluttershy? What creature? She lightly pointed a hoof over Applejack's shoulder. Applejack's eyes widened as she wheeled around, looking to where the creature had landed. What? Where did it go? I just bucked it a minute ago. Rainbow Dash landed down next to Twilight, a slight smile on her face. Why would you buck something so awesome? It saved these three in. It was hunkered over Apple Bloom, ready to hurt her. Applejack shifted nervously in her hoofs. I didn't think it was helping. Sweetie Belle jumped in front of Scootaloo. It did this weird, cool thing where its hands glowed and it ran them over Apple Bloom, and then she was able to wake up and be back to normal. Twilight blinked a moment before smiling. That sounds like a healing spell. Very tricky. Maybe it's friendly and just wanted to help. Applejack frowned. But no. You mean to say I heard some pony was just trying to help my sister? Her eyes lowered as to her eyes. I feel mighty low right now. Fluttershy trotted over and placed a hoof on Applejack's shoulder. There, Applejack, I'm sure it's all right. I'm sure it would understand why you did what you did. But where did it go? Applejack sighed and turned back to Big Macintosh. Big Mac, can you take Applebloom and the other two girls back to the farmhouse and get them cleaned up before dinner? He nodded with a little smile. Yup, and tomorrow I'll build a new clubhouse. This made the three fillies break out into a large smile. Applejack turned to her friends with a sigh, her eyes looking down. Girls, I need your help. If I'm going to find this thing and apologize, that means tracking it down. Rainbow Dash stomped her hoof down. With a tracker like me, we'll find it 10 seconds flat. Twilight trotted over to where Applejack had pointed before. Well, girls, if we're going to find it, we need to get started. Scene change. Grevin, edge of Sweet Apple Acres. Dusk. Grevin thanked his good fortune to get away from the confrontation when the other, for lack of a better term, ponies arrived. He had taken the opportunity to duck out into the orchard, using his training to move silently through the trees at a brisk pace. He currently found himself at the edge of the orchard and near what appeared to be a fairly average forest. He rested his back against a tree and took a deep breath, only to feel a fierce cough rip through his lungs, causing him to bend down, resting his hands on his knees. He raised a hand to his jaw, again wincing at how tender was still left. Thankfully, the blood had dried and he was beginning to feel better. But he wished he had met these creatures under better circumstances. But for now, the young ones were safe, and that was all that was important. He needed to take stock of what he had left after his most recent trip. He knew he still had his armor and gauntlets. He still had his swords, and fortunately his cloak was unscathed. Unfortunately, his travel pack was missing, which meant he had no spare clothes, no rations, though with the fresh fruit in his orchard he didn't have to worry about food in that respect. He didn't know the land he was in, what the dangers were, and what was safe, but that wasn't really what concerned him. He was still worried about his mission, the protection of the people of Bastion. He had to figure out why he was here, and what it would take to get back. Clearing his throat once again, he rose back to his full height, pulled his cloak around him tightly, and glanced around, making certain the coast was clear, before heading into the forest before him. He wasn't certain what he would find, but he did receive the impression that if he were not careful, he could find himself in a far worse situation than before. Moving silently through the brush, his mind began to wander back to the portal that pulled him into this world. Why did it happen? What caused it? The most obvious answer was magic, but it had to be powerful magic to rip open a portal such as that. He paused a moment in mid-step as another thought hit him. He knew how to cast some spells, which meant he had a feel for magic. He had to in order to control it. Perhaps he could use a little bit of his magic to help track down the source of what pulled him here in the first place. He closed his eyes once again and began to call upon the magic within himself, allowing just enough to flow into his fingertips. Once that was done, he slowly held out a hand and began to sweep it in front of him, hoping for some sort of sensation to help direct him in the right direction. For several minutes he swept his hand back and forth as he walked each step, lowering his hope until he felt it. Ever so faint, ever so weak, it was there. A simple tug at his fingers. He paused, his breathing still coming in slowly. He turned himself toward the sensation and opened his eyes, dropping his hands. Before he could continue any further, he took a careful look around, noting the large paw marks that surrounded the area. They were padded and had some claw marks, so it was clear that he would need to run, lest he become a snack for them. He quickened his pace, quickly running through a small creek, hoping that he could reach his destination before sunrise. Scene change. Sweet Apple Acres. Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash floated back down to where Twilight and Applejack waited on the edge of the orchard. I'm sorry, girls, but there was no sign of it in the rest of the orchard. Applejack frowned, kicking a rock with her hoof. Shoot, where could it have gone? Twi, you got any ideas? Twilight put a hoof to her chin. Well, we know it's fast, so it could be anywhere by now. We also know that it doesn't know the area, meaning it would probably look for a place to hide. We also know he can use magic. She gasped as her gaze brought her in sight of the ever-free forest. If I were him, I'd go into the forest. It'd be the perfect place to hide. Fluttershy squeaked. You mean we have to go in there again? She pointed a shaky hoof at the ominous forest. Twilight nodded as she walked past her nervous friend. Not only that, but if it was brought here by magic, and he can use magic, that means there's only one place it would be drawn to, the place where we found the elements of harmony. Applejack frowned but began to move forward. Well, it doesn't do us any good sitting around here. The night's young and we're burned time. Rainbow frowned. AJ, why are you so interested in finding this guy? Applejack sighed. Look, girls, I was a real sour apple with this person. It helped save my sister and saved her and her friends. And hadn't I repay it? I bucked it as hard as I could in the job. I was ready to hurt it for no reason. I didn't stop and even ask what was going on. I have to apologize for what I've done. I just have to. Rainbow paused and nodded. I understand, AJ. She looked around to the others. Come on, guys. We know where the castle's ruins are, so we'll get there in no time. Let's go. Scene change. Everfree Forest. Nighttime. The further he traveled into the forest, the darker and more foreboding it became. The very air seemed to close in and press its weight upon him with each step. He smirked, noting how familiar it felt to the same locations that he found his armor and his sword in. Ancient ruins that were not meant to be seen or walked in again. If this place was anything like that, then at any moment he would find something amazing and potentially dangerous. As he rounded a bend moving around a particularly thick batch of trees, he frowned, noting that he needed to stop guessing these kinds of things if he were ever to lead a normal life. Just before him was a rickety-looking rope bridge that led across a large cliffside, and on the other end was the ruins of what he could only guess was at one time a grand castle. He hesitantly made his way up the bridge, and after a brief check of its sturdiness, he placed a foot upon the first plank. Might as well get this over with. He slowly crossed the bridge, being careful not to allow his full body weight to stay in one position too long, lest the wooden slats break under his weight. Wiping some of the sweat from his brow, he tensed, hearing the familiar sound of wolves howling in the night. Looking over his shoulder, he could almost see some brush across the gorge rustling. With any luck, those wolves would not be brave enough or smart enough to cross that bridge, and he wouldn't have to worry about being attacked by a hungry pack. Turning back to the ruins, he couldn't help but smirk. Why is it that ruins are always involved? Why don't they ever take all the important things before they leave these places? He shook his head, berating himself for talking to himself, and walked inside, uncertain of what he would find.